April 3rd, 1944. 25,000 feet above Leipzig. The air is thin, the sky is cold, and the war still very much undecided. Inside the tight glass canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf-109, Oberfeldwebel Dieter Klein adjusts his oxygen mask. The frost creeping along the edges of the glass makes the world look distant, dreamlike. He was 21 years old, already a veteran, already tired, but his eyes, sharp and unforgiving, his hands, steady as ever. Below him, the factories industrial of the lungs gasping black for breath, smoke like war machines, ammunition, synthetic fuel, all flowing from a continent still clinging to the illusion of control. The ground was still theirs, the air not yet contested, or so they thought. Peter glances at his wingman, a nod. They had done this countless times before. Intercept incoming American bombers, slash through their tight formations, fire, break away, return home. The Luftwaffe was bloodied, but undefeated. They still believed they could stop the tide. Above the roar of the engine, the radio crackles. Multiple bogies spotted southwest, estimated altitude 20,000, formation tight, possible B-17s. Dieter smiles under the mask. Nothing he hadn't seen before. He rolls the aircraft left and begins the dive. The gray silhouette of the bomber stream glimmers in the distance like an approaching storm front. He knows this dance. The Americans bring their flying fortresses. The Luftwaffe cuts through them like knives in cloth. But today, something feels off. The contrails are too high, too fast. There's a rhythm to them that doesn't match what he's used to. The bomber stream looks familiar, but the escorts are different, sleeker, more agile, and they're not turning back. That was always the weakness, the Achilles heel of the American raids. Their fighters, P-47s mostly, were strong but thirsty. They could only escort the bombers part of the way. After they peeled off, the Luftwaffe struck hard and fast. It was predictable. It was manageable. But not today. Dieter steadies his plane, squinting against the sun. Then, like shadows slicing through silver, he sees them. Thin, deadly, closing, fast. His instincts scream before the radio does. They were not thunderbolts. They were something else entirely. He banks sharply, tries to climb, but they're already behind him. A flash, a burst of tracer rounds. The wing of his aircraft shudders as it takes a hit. He pulls hard into a dive, heart pounding, flooding beneath his flight cap. Behind him, his wingman disappears in a streak of flame and vapor. The sky, once familiar, is now foreign. What Dieter didn't know, and what many of them wouldn't live long enough to understand, was that they were witnessing the arrival of something new. Something that would not just fight back, but push the Luftwaffe into extinction. In that moment, far above Leipzig, the Luftwaffe still existed as an idea, as pride, as legend. But in the thin, freezing air of that April morning, something else was taking its place. A sound, a silhouette, a scream that cut through the confidence of veterans and the steel nerves of aces. The beginning of an end none of them were prepared to face. And yet, it had been coming for months. By early 1944, Germany still had aces, still had jet prototypes and flak corridors. But what it lacked, what it had begun to lose quietly and irreversibly, was initiative. The skies were no longer a playground of dominance. They were turning into a graveyard. Fuel shortages, exhausted training programs, factories bombed, recruits with barely 30 hours in the air. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging faster than it could recover, and the Americans, they were accelerating. Their industry did not sleep. Their pilots were fresh, their tactics evolving, and now their planes had changed. To the German high command, the reports at first seemed exaggerated. A new fighter, longer range, escorting all the way to Berlin and back, sounded like myth, propaganda, an American fantasy. But the men in the sky knew better. They had seen it, heard it. A scream that pierced the clouds, a shadow that danced through tracer fire, a machine that didn't retreat. It hunted. And as Dieter Klein limped his wounded aircraft back toward what was once considered friendly airspace, he looked over his shoulder one last time. He didn't see an enemy plane, only the empty sky. That, somehow, was worse, because for the first time, the Luftwaffe was not outnumbered. It was outpaced, outthought, outbuilt. The cold clarity of that morning would haunt the few who made it back, not because of what they lost, but because they understood that something irreversible had begun. And from this altitude, They could see it coming from miles away. If this kind of history hits you, let it be known. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that bring the war's forgotten echoes back to life. To the pilots of the Luftwaffe, the American escort fighters were never truly feared. They were seen as brave, yes, but predictable, limited, weak. The term milk bottles was passed around Luftwaffe hangars with mocking ease, a reference to the twin-engine P-38 Lightnings and the bulky P-47 Thunderbolts that often turned back before the real battle began. German pilots had learned to wait. Wait until the Americans ran out of protection. Wait until the bombers were alone. Then strike like wolves. For months, it worked. Bombing missions relied on brute force. Their fortresses flew in tight formations, armed with defensive guns on all sides. But the Luftwaffe knew the rhythm. The P-47s would escort them over France, maybe into Western Germany. But they always turned back. They had no choice. Their fuel tanks simply could not take them all the way. This gap, this invisible line drawn in the sky, was sacred to the Luftwaffe. They called it the killing zone. It stretched east of the Rhine, deep into German airspace. Beyond that line, American bombers flew naked, vulnerable. And it was there that the Luftwaffe had bled them dry. Missions to Schweinfurt, to Regensburg, to Berlin, they were meat grinders. Planes did not just fall, they vanished, burned, exploded mid-air. In a single raid over Schweinfurt in 1943, 60 American bombers were lost. Over 500 airmen were declared missing or dead. It was unsustainable. But then, the line moved. No one noticed at first. The change came silently. Not with a roar, but with a whistle. German radar stations picked up fast-moving aircraft, escorting the bombers deeper than expected. At first, they were dismissed. Some Luftwaffe commanders thought they were modified Thunderbolts. Others claimed it was just better coordination. They were wrong, because what the radar picked up, and what the pilots soon faced, was not just an escort, it was a predator. The first sightings were met with confusion. Thin wings, long nose, a shape unlike anything they had seen. Faster than expected, always in the right place, always attacking at the worst moment. They would dive from the sun, strike hard, and vanish. Not retreating, repositioning. Soon, every German pilot knew the silhouette by heart. The belly tank, the slender profile, the silver finish reflecting the sky. A machine that could fly from England to Berlin and back. The P-51 Mustang. At first, Luftwaffe squadrons tried to adapt. They engaged, they maneuvered, but it was these fighters now didn't just escort, they hunted. And they didn't break off when things got dangerous. They stayed, every second, every mile, all the way to the target, all the way home. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological impact was devastating. The milk bottles had become monsters. One German pilot, Hauptmann Erich Menzel, recounted in his journal what it was like facing Mustangs for the first time. We climbed above the bombers to strike, but before we could position, they were already there. Not defending, waiting. That word, waiting, stuck. The Mustangs didn't just defend bombers, they anticipated attacks. They intercepted before the Luftwaffe could even form a proper assault. They neutralized the defenders before the attackers ever saw the bombers. It flipped the entire dynamic of the war in the air. They were not escorts anymore. They were executioners. And it wasn't just their presence, it was their persistence. Every time the Luftwaffe tried to fall back and regroup, the Mustangs followed. If they tried to dive away, the Mustangs dove faster. If they tried to outclimb, the Mustangs climbed higher. If they scattered, the Mustangs picked them off one by one. In the words of another pilot, it felt like they had no limits, no ceiling, no fatigue, as if they were built not just to fight, but to destroy our belief in survival. And perhaps that was their most dangerous weapon. Not firepower, not speed, but despair. The Luftwaffe's strength had always been its confidence, its experience, its calculated aggression. But how do you fight something that never turns back? How do you engage when the enemy is always one step ahead? How do you command a defense when your defenders never return? Reports began flooding the German high command. Aces were dying, squadrons vanishing. Engagements that used to last minutes were now over in seconds. The enemy had changed, and the German skies, once dominated by skill and instinct, had become a stage for slaughter. Worse still, the pilots began to sense it. A subtle fear crept in. Missions that used to be routine now felt like suicide runs. The enemy was no longer predictable, and unpredictability is terror. In hangars across the Reich, flight logs showed a grim trend. Sorties were shorter, success rates dropping, and even when the Luftwaffe did land hits, the bombers kept coming. Because now they had cover. True cover. Not limited by fuel. Not confined by time. The Americans had erased the killing, and in its place, they left a message. You will never fly safely again. By early spring, whispers of the Mustang reached even the youngest recruits. They had names for it: the Silver Spear, the Screaming Ghost. Some thought it had an engine from hell. Others believed it was flown by men who never slept. Whatever they believed, one thing was clear. It had changed everything. If you're still here, you're one of us. The ones who care. The ones who listen to echoes that history tried to bury. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Share this with someone who loves real stories. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because we're just getting started. It didn't look like a game changer. At first glance, the P-51 Mustang seemed almost too delicate for war. Its lines were sleek, its wings long and narrow. It didn't carry the brutal, armored weight of a thunderbolt. It didn't have the double tails of the lightning. It looked almost graceful. But looks, in war, can be a fatal illusion. The truth was this: the Mustang was not designed to look deadly. It was engineered to be inevitable, and it arrived at the exact moment the Allies needed a miracle in the skies. When the first prototypes flew in 1940, the Mustang was promising but limited. The early versions carried Allison engines, reliable but weak at high altitudes. The USAAF needed a long-range fighter that could fly above 20,000 feet and still maintain speed, maneuverability, and firepower. The P-51 had the body. It just needed the right heart. That heart came from across the ocean. The British, desperate for a better escort fighter, proposed a radical solution. What if they fitted the P-51 airframe with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine? At first, it sounded like desperation, a patchwork fix. But once installed, the results were stunning. The Merlin-powered Mustang flew higher, faster, and farther than any Allied single-engine fighter before it. It was smooth, responsive, precise. Aviation historian Walter Boyne once said, "The Mustang was the airplane that could do everything, and do it better than anything else in the sky." By 1943, the Americans licensed the Merlin engine and began mass-producing it through Packard in Detroit. Now they had the power. Now they had the numbers. And now, the Mustang wasn't just fast, it was unstoppable. With a top speed of over 700 kilometers per hour, 650 caliber Browning machine guns, and drop tanks that extended its range beyond 2,500 kilometers, the P-51 could do what no fighter had done before. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, without stopping, without turning, and without mercy. The Mustangs were light, but strong. Their wings sliced through the air with minimal drag, allowing them to climb fast and dive faster. They could turn tight without stalling, and had enough fuel to stay in the fight long after the Luftwaffe ran dry. But what made the Mustang terrifying wasn't just its numbers, it was its behavior. German pilots, quickly, realized that these new enemies didn't fly like the old ones. They were more patient, more surgical. They didn't chase recklessly or waste energy on long dogfights. They stalked, they waited, they struck only when the kill was certain. This was the beginning of the Mustang doctrine. Boom and zoom. Hit hard from above, climb, regroup, hit again. While earlier American fighters relied on brute force and close combat, the Mustang played the war like chess. It used altitude as its shield, speed as its weapon. Its pilots didn't need to get lucky, they just needed time. Because with time, the Mustang would win. Even Luftwaffe ace Johannes Steinhoff admitted in his post-war memoirs, "You could shoot down 1 or 2 Mustangs, but they always came back in force. And soon, you were outnumbered, outflown, and you knew it." Behind every Mustang was the weight of American industry. Each one was a product of Ford-like assembly lines. While German fighters were handmade in bombed-out factories, the mighty P-51 rolled off production lines with brutal consistency. Detroit, Dallas, and Inglewood turned out thousands. No delays, no shortages, just more fighters, month after month. By the end of the war, over 15,000 Mustangs had been built, and while other planes came and went, the P-51 kept flying. In Europe, in the Pacific, even into the Korean War. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol. To American crews flying deep into Germany, the Mustang was a guardian angel. They watched those silver wings glide above their formations, turning into the sun, intercepting threats before they arrived. The bomber gunners no longer braced for the moment when the escorts turned back, because the Mustang never turned back. To the Germans, it was a shadow they could never shake, a sound they could never silence, a presence that turned the open sky into a prison. You didn't hear it approach, you just saw flashes, felt the shudder, then fire. There's a report from a German airfield near Merseburg in late 1944. A mechanic looked up and saw 3 Mustangs circling above, high and silent. He called them vultures, not because of what they did, but because of what they waited for. The Mustang didn't just fight the Luftwaffe, it starved it of fuel, of hope, of time. It arrived at a moment when Germany was already struggling to keep up, and it made sure they never caught their breath again. Every mission it flew pulled another thread from the fabric of the Luftwaffe, not with brutality, but with precision, with rhythm, with inevitability. And in this slow, methodical destruction, a myth was born. A machine, built by assembly lines, flown by young men barely out of training, became one of the most feared sights in the European sky. Some pilots claimed they could hear the Mustang before they saw it, that high-pitched whine of the Merlin engine, pushing the propeller blades just past the threshold of harmony. It wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. To the Luftwaffe, it was a ghost. To the Americans, it was salvation. And to history, it was the plane that ended the war in the air. If this story meant something to you, let your voice be heard. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button and help us bring these forgotten echoes back into the light. The sky was quiet for a moment, not silent, just quiet enough to make a pilot hesitate. Oberleutnant Karl Mahler had flown over 60 missions. He knew the rhythm of combat. He had fought over Stalingrad, defended Hamburg, and survived the brutal chaos of the Channel Front. But this felt different, not because of what he saw, but because of what he heard. He was flying high above the Leipzig rail yards, leading a flight of Bf-109s to intercept yet another wave of American bombers. From altitude, the city looked like a model. Smoke rising from chimneys, trains snaking between factories. The landscape seemed peaceful, controlled. But far to the west, a familiar shimmer in the air marked their arrival. Contrails, dozens of them. Thick white lines arcing across the horizon, like claws reaching for the heart of Germany. Mahler's orders were simple: climb, hit the bombers, break them apart, survive. But something made him pause. As he positioned his aircraft for the dive, a sound reached him. Not the deep rumble of radial engines, not the stuttering bark of flak. This was something else. Thin, piercing, metallic, almost like a scream being dragged across steel. It came from above. Unfamiliar, sharp. It sliced through the oxygen-thin air like a blade. Then came the flash, a silver glint in the sun, and then another. Sleek shapes darting between clouds with unnatural grace. They weren't diving on the bombers, they were climbing toward him. Mahler's instincts kicked in. He rolled hard to the right, pushing the nose of his Messerschmitt downward into a shallow dive. Behind him, one of his wingmen was already gone, torn apart by a burst of machine gun fire that seemed to come out of nowhere. The other broke formation, desperate to escape. The formation collapsed in seconds. They never made it to the bombers. The Mustangs hadn't just arrived. They had been waiting. This wasn't a dogfight. It was an ambush, executed with precision. The Americans hadn't climbed to defend. They had climbed to hunt. And Mahler realized, too late, that they were not the ones choosing the fight anymore. That moment was not unique. Dozens of similar encounters happened daily in early 1944. Pilots reported being intercepted long before they reached the bomber streams. They couldn't figure out how or why. Some believed the Americans had cracked their radio codes. Others suspected new radar technology. But the truth was simpler. The Mustang gave the Allies something they had never had before: control of the battlefield. With long range, high speed, and superior altitude performance, The P-51 could dictate the terms of engagement. German pilots were no longer predators. They were being engaged at their own front doors. Before they could form attack patterns, before they could even see the bombers, the Mustangs had turned the sky into a trap, and the Luftwaffe kept flying straight into it. There was something uniquely terrifying about the way the Mustang struck. Unlike other fighters that would dogfight aggressively or retreat when outnumbered, the Mustang seemed to float above it all, watching, calculating, waiting for the precise moment to dive with overwhelming speed and force. Then, just as quickly, it would climb again, vanishing into the sun. Pilots began calling it the Silver Ghost. It was not uncommon for Luftwaffe crews to report feeling hunted before a single shot had been fired. The sound of that high-pitched Merlin engine became a psychological weapon. It wasn't just a noise, it was a warning, a cold promise that someone was coming, fast, and they would not miss. One German gunner, stationed near Kassel, recalled seeing a Mustang appear out of the clouds during a clear morning. He said, "It didn't attack us, not at first. It just flew alongside, matching our speed, as if it was studying us. Then it pulled up and was gone. 10 minutes later, half the squadron was dead." That behavior was not random. It was part of a larger shift in American air combat doctrine. The Mustang allowed the USAAF to move from defensive escort to offensive control. They began splitting Mustang squadrons into roving hunter groups. These units were not tied to the key bombers. Their job was to seek and destroy enemy fighters before they ever got close. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe wasn't fighting one battle. They were fighting two. One above the bombers, where survival was now nearly impossible, and one in the space between bases, where invisible hunters waited with altitude, speed, and ammunition to spare. And that second battle was where the Luftwaffe bled the most. Many German pilots never made it to their targets. They were intercepted during takeoff, on climb, out, or just as they reached cruising altitude. The skies over central Germany became a graveyard of burning wreckage and parachutes. Mustangs patrolled like sentinels, not just protecting, but eliminating. There's a well-known case from April 1944. A German squadron stationed at Werl was scrambled to intercept a bomber stream headed toward Brunswick. They never even left their airspace. Within 7 minutes, 5 of the 12 aircraft were gone, shot down at high altitude before the pilots even saw a single American bomber. In that moment, the Germans realized something devastating. They were no longer fighting a war of attrition. They were fighting a war of extinction. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was being disassembled, not with spectacle, but with consistency. And the P-51 was the tool chosen for the job. Not every Mustang pilot was an ace. Many were young, inexperienced, but the machine they flew turned them into predators. Their aircraft gave them reach, speed, a margin of error, and above all, it gave them time. Time to see the enemy first, time to position, time to survive. The Mustang did not give them victory, it gave them choice. For the Germans, that choice had been taken away. In the black boxes of downed Bf-109s and FW-190s, American intelligence found radio chatter filled with panic. Words like ambush, ghosts, gone, voices trembling in mid-combat. Not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy was everywhere, and sounded the same. That metallic whine of the Merlin engine, that scream that cut through the clouds before a single round was fired. It echoed through cockpits, through radios, through nightmares. The Luftwaffe was running out of time, and the Mustang made sure they knew it. If stories like this connect with you, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you're finding value here, consider subscribing. We're rebuilding history, one forgotten moment at a time. Before the Mustang, the sky was divided. American bombers flew with courage, but they flew into hell. Once they crossed the Rhine, their world changed. The Luftwaffe had created what pilots called the Black Curtain. It was an invisible line in the sky where the protection ended and the real war began. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could escort them part way, but they always turned back. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Their fuel would deep into Germany. And so, in 1943, the 8th Air Force sent formations of B-17s and B-24s into the heart of Nazi industry, knowing that, for the most dangerous part of the journey, they would be alone. In October of that year, 291 bombers launched toward Schweinfurt, a mission designed to cripple German ball-bearing production. The Luftwaffe was waiting. 60 bombers never returned. More than 600 men were killed or captured in a single day. It was one of the most catastrophic air losses in American history. The generals in Washington and London understood what the numbers meant. Without a solution, daylight strategic bombing was unsustainable. But by early 1944, something had changed. The black curtain began to fall. The Mustang had arrived, and with it came a new kind of warfare in the sky. At first, it was subtle. A few P-51s joining missions to test endurance and performance. Then more, then squadrons. By March, entire escort groups of Mustangs were with the bombers. And unlike the others, they did not leave. They went all the way. From the bases in England, across the Channel, over the flatlands of occupied France, through the web of flak and radar stations, deep into the industrial heart of the Reich, and then back, mission after mission, week after week, unbroken coverage, constant pressure. The results were immediate. Bomber losses, once catastrophic, dropped by half. Luftwaffe interceptions became disorganized and rare. Squadrons, German, once fearsome and confident, now hesitated. Their surprise attacks were intercepted. Their formations shattered before they reached the bombers. The Mustang had not just protected the American airmen, it had stolen the initiative from the enemy. It became harder for the Luftwaffe to mount effective counterattacks. They began to shift tactics, using fewer planes per engagement, relying on hit-and-run strikes, or staying grounded entirely to avoid losses. But every time they went up, Mustangs were waiting. By spring, the skies over Germany were no longer a hunting ground. They had become a killing field. But not for the Americans. The 8th Air Force took full advantage of the shift. They increased bombing frequency, raised mission altitudes, and hit targets once considered untouchable. Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, railroad hubs. Nothing was safe anymore. And the reason was silver, fast, unforgiving. The Mustang didn't just protect the bomber stream. It expanded the reach of the entire Allied air campaign. One Mustang pilot, Captain James Goodson, wrote in his letters, "We started by defending the bombers. Then we started defending ourselves. Then, one day we realized we weren't defending anything. We were clearing the skies. This new air dominance changed everything." The Luftwaffe, once dominant, found itself forced into reactive defense. Their resources were dwindling. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. New recruits arrived with barely a month of training and were thrown into a sky filled with veterans and machines they could not match. It was an uneven war now, and the Mustang was the reason why. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing over 25% of its operational aircraft every month. Fuel shortages crippled their ability to even scramble. Allied bombing raids were now hammering the oil refineries and transportation hubs. The P-51s patrolled constantly, sweeping the sky clean of resistance. For German pilots, the very act of taking off became a risk. Mustangs flew low-level patrols near airfields. They hit runways, strafed hangars, destroyed aircraft during takeoff. Even on the ground, the Luftwaffe was no longer safe. There is a recorded account from a pilot named Kurt Welter, who described a mission where his group of night fighters attempted a daytime scramble during a surprise raid. "We barely lifted off. The Mustangs were already in the pattern. They came from nowhere. We were targets before we were even airborne." This wasn't a war of dogfights anymore. It was a war of extermination, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. The Allies needed the Luftwaffe gone. Every plane, every hangar, every hope. Because only then would the path to Normandy be clear. Only then could the Allies ensure that when they landed, no German aircraft would be left to strike the beaches. The Mustang was not just a guardian of bombers, it was the advance guard of liberation. The numbers tell the rest of the story. In January 1944, bomber losses averaged 1 out of every 12 aircraft. By July, that number had dropped to 1 in 40. Not because the enemy was weaker, but because the Mustang was stronger. Fewer bombers lost, fewer crews captured, more targets destroyed, more missions completed, and all of it rested on a simple truth. The Mustang had erased the boundary between safety and danger. There was no more killing zone. There was no more sanctuary for the Luftwaffe. Not above cities, not above forests, not even above their own airfields. For the first time in the war, the Germans had nowhere left to run. If this moved you, if it made you feel something deep for the men who flew into that sky, leave a comment. We want to hear what you think. And if you believe more people should know stories like this, help us out by subscribing. Let's keep these memories alive, one mission at a time. By the summer of 1944, the war in the air was no longer a contest. It was a collapse. The Luftwaffe, once proud and feared, had become a shadow of itself. The men who had once flown with supreme confidence now looked to the skies with unease. Their edge, their reputation, their superiority. It had all been worn down by months of relentless pressure and devastating attrition. And at the heart of that pressure was a sound, a sharp, metallic whine, a howl that rose and fell like a blade slicing through clouds. The scream of the Mustang. No precise moment when morale breaks. It doesn't happen all at once. It erodes quietly, in the hangars, in the briefings, in the moments before takeoff. Pilots began to notice the empty seats in the ready room, friends who didn't come back, names no longer called. It wasn't just death that haunted them, it was futility. By mid-1944, Germany's top aces were either dead or grounded. Galland, Marseille, Steinhoff, those who survived had been reassigned or injured. The few that remained were stretched thin. One veteran pilot was expected to lead a dozen new recruits, many with fewer than 20 hours in the cockpit. Some had never even fired their guns in flight. They were sent into the sky knowing that what waited for them was not training, not learning, but slaughter. One former instructor at a Luftwaffe school near Königsberg described his final class. Half of them could barely land the aircraft, but we had no time. They were needed immediately, so we prayed. The Mustang didn't allow them the luxury of mistakes. It hunted them before they could even climb to combat altitude. And when they tried to escape, the Mustang followed, high above, always watching, fast enough to catch anything, agile enough to stay out of reach. Its long legs meant it never had to disengage. Its superior guns meant it rarely missed. There is a haunting report from a pilot named Hans Becker, who survived a July sortie near Frankfurt. We never saw the enemy, only tracers. 1 second we were flying. The next, 2 of my friends were gone. There was no warning, no radio call, just silence. That silence became deafening. Radio chatter, once filled with confident orders and squadron callouts, turned frantic, then quieter. Luftwaffe pilots stopped chasing bombers. They stopped responding to Mustang sightings. Many simply turned around, or climbed away, or dropped altitude, hoping to be ignored. The fear was no longer of defeat, it was of irrelevance. The Luftwaffe had once defined air combat. Now it could barely participate. German commanders knew it. American analysts confirmed it, and the men in the cockpits felt it in their bones. This wasn't war anymore, it was disintegration. In the field, German mechanics cannibalized damaged aircraft just to keep a handful in the air. Fuel was rationed so strictly that some missions were canceled before they even began. Aircraft would taxi out, only to shut down at the end of the runway. No fuel, no future, and yet the Mustangs kept coming. They flew with freedom. Long missions, clean takeoffs, flawless coordination. Their formations stretched for miles, silver reflections cutting across the sky. They moved as one, fast, focused, unbreakable. The impact went beyond tactics. It sank into the soul. German civilians began to notice the change. Children in the countryside would point to the sky and whisper, not in awe, in fear. Factories stopped operating in daylight. Supply routes shifted to night runs. Even then, the P-51s. Some units began flying low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions, strafing trains, trucks, columns of reinforcements. The Mustang was no longer just a threat to aircraft. It was a predator across all levels of the battlefield. Stories spread like wildfire. A squadron of P-51s had destroyed an entire convoy outside Munich. Another had taken out 3 locomotives in a single pass. Rural workers heard the approaching roar and dove into ditches. Farmers abandoned tractors in the ihadivabi fields when they saw the glint of sunlight off silver wings. The Germans tried to adapt. They pushed forward new models like the FW-190 Dora and the Me-262 jet. But even these were too little, too late. The Dora was powerful, but outnumbered. The Me-262 was revolutionary, but it was fragile, unreliable, and often vulnerable during takeoff or landing. Mustangs began patrolling near jet bases, waiting for the brief moment when the German jets were most exposed. And when they found them, they struck with ruthless precision. It was not about bravery anymore. It was about inevitability. The Luftwaffe had been pushed beyond its limits, and the final breaking point wasn't a massive battle. It was something smaller, quieter. A pilot sitting in his cockpit, engine running, eyes staring at the sky, knowing what was waiting for him out there, and choosing not to go. That is the moment when a war ends. Not when the bombs fall, not when the surrender is signed, but when the will to fight. The Mustang had done more than dominate the air. It had shattered the myth of German air supremacy. It had burned away the pride, the arrogance, the belief in invincibility. All that remained was fear, and that fear took a sound. The high-pitched whine of a Merlin engine at full throttle. A sound that meant the hunter was already above you, that your fight was already over, that the sky no longer belonged to you. If this part of the story left you speechless or reflective, take a moment to share that feeling. Drop a comment and let others know what this history means to you. And if you want to keep this kind of storytelling alive, subscribing helps more than you know. Every click helps preserve a piece of what should never be forgotten. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The guns had fallen silent. Cities smoldered under gray skies. Trains sat rusting on broken rails. Flags were lowered, papers signed, and from the ruins, something resembling peace began to stir. But for those who had flown through the fire, the silence was louder than the engine's roar. The airfields that once buzzed with tension now stood still. Empty cockpits, silent radios, hangars echoing with the absence of urgency. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, had ceased to exist, not with a final battle, but with a slow and undeniable fade into nothingness. And above it all, drifting across the sky with the ghost of a once ferocious war, was a sound burned into memory. The scream of the P-51 Mustang. That sound had marked the end long before the surrender. It was the voice of inevitability, the soundtrack of an empire collapsing from the clouds downward. It was not just an engine, it was a prophecy. In those final weeks, German fighter groups were grounded not by orders, but by reality. Fuel was gone. Spare parts were gone. The pilots were gone. Of those who remained, most had lost the will to climb. They knew what waited up there. Not just death, but defeat. American air superiority wasn't just a tactical achievement, it was psychological conquest. When the P-51 roared above a city, it didn't just mean bombs would fall, it meant that the Reich was no longer in control of its own sky, and the people knew it. Civilians stopped looking up. They stopped asking where the planes were going. They stopped believing in a final miracle, because every engine tone that echoed overhead reminded them of something their leaders had refused to say out loud. The war was lost. The Mustang had become a symbol of that truth, a silver blade cutting through fog and fire. It didn't come to terrify, it came to remind. Every pass, every escort, every silent glide through enemy airspace was a declaration. The world had changed. The illusion had ended. And even when the enemy no longer fired, the Mustangs flew. They flew over shattered cities, over silent forests, over roads littered with wreckage and surrendering columns, not in aggression, but in confirmation that the skies, at last, were free. For the men who flew them, the war left a mark that never faded. Pilots returned home to quiet neighborhoods, to families who barely recognized them. Many were still boys, carrying the weight of something too big for their years. But in the stories they carried, one machine always stood at the center, the P-51 Mustang. It had begun as a desperate experiment, a borrowed engine, a bet on design. It became, over time, a force of nature, not just because of what it could, but because of what it meant. Speed, range, power, precision, but also discipline, strategy, relentlessness. And beyond the metal, beyond the stats and numbers, the Mustang represented the industrial engine of democracy. It was not born in a castle or designed by a genius in a bunker. It was hammered out in factories by thousands of hands, built on assembly lines, flown by kids from Illinois and Kansas and California. It was not perfect, but it didn't have to be. It only had to show up every day without fail. And it did. By the end of the war, over 15,000 P-51s had been produced. They flew in Europe. In the Pacific, they escorted B-17s over Berlin and later chased Zeros over the South China Sea. They adapted, endured, survived. Some would continue flying into the 1950s. Others would sit forgotten in airfields or sold for scrap. But a few, a precious few, still fly today. You can hear that sound even now if you're lucky. That same sharp Merlin whine cutting through the blue. And when you do, you won't need to look. You'll know it's a Mustang. And the sky, just for a moment, feels like 1944 again. Thank you for walking through this history with us, for feeling what others felt, for remembering what others lived. These stories are not just about machines. They are about courage, about loss, about what happens when technology meets determination. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Let others know what it meant to you. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and join a growing community that believes history should not be buried in textbooks. There's another story waiting. Click on the next video that's about to appear on your screen. Let's keep flying.